When I was a child, I lived in a small farmhouse on 2 acres of land. Our home wasn't a bustling farm, but over the years, many different animals passed through. We had cats, dogs, chickens, rabbits, and even a few farm animals that visited from time to time. My mother was a compassionate veterinarian who dedicated much of her free time to caring for animals in need. She helped sick, injured, or mistreated animals and found them safe and loving homes. Our home was peaceful and quiet, filled with the sounds of birds singing and wildlife moving about, a constant reminder that we didn't live in the city. Behind our house, a wooded trail wound through the trees, and during the warmer months, it was often used by tourists, hikers, and campers. I loved reading and spent a lot of time in our barn. It was located at the back of our property along the fence line, and I would often sit there for hours, caring for the animals and getting lost in my books. Sometimes, I could hear people chatting and laughing as they walked along the trail. When I was 10, I usually arrived home from school about an hour before my mother finished work. I was a responsible child, so she trusted me to take the bus home and start my chores on my own. That day, as always, I stepped off the school bus, unlatched the front gate, and walked up the dirt driveway toward the house. Once inside, I headed straight to the kitchen and made myself a snack, an old-fashioned peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a cold glass of milk. Then, I carried my food outside and walked toward the barn. I had a well-established afternoon routine. Usually, our dogs would run up to greet me, barking excitedly and wagging their tails. But that day, they were nowhere in sight. I called for them, but they didn't come. Instead, I heard muffled barking coming from inside the barn. That was odd because we never locked the dogs in there. During the day, they roamed freely outside, and at night, they slept indoors with us. I set my snack down on an old tree stump near the barn and cautiously approached the door. Slowly, I pulled it open to check on the dogs. The moment the door swung wide, all 3 of them bolted out, tails wagging happily. I knelt down, relieved to see they were perfectly fine. After they greeted me, I glanced into the barn from the doorway. There was no one inside. Maybe my mom had locked them in that morning for some reason, or perhaps the wind had blown the barn door shut, trapping them inside. I didn't think much of it. Picking up my snack, I sat on a bale of hay inside the barn. The dogs settled at my feet, eagerly accepting small bites of my sandwich. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone. A tall, gaunt man with long, messy gray hair walked past the barn entrance, muttering strange, unintelligible words. His voice was low and eerie, almost as if he was speaking in a language I'd never heard before. What struck me as even stranger was my dog's reaction. Normally, if a stranger appeared on our property, they would bark and rush over to investigate. But this time, they simply glanced in his direction, wagged their tails curiously, and then returned to sitting near me. A small pang of unease settled in my stomach, but not enough to make me feel real fear. After all, I was just a kid, and my dog seemed calm. Curious, I tiptoed to the doorway and peeked out for a better look. The man was extremely thin, his ribs and spine visible beneath his tattered clothing. His unkempt hair looked like a bird's nest, and his scruffy beard was just as wild. He had wandered over to our chicken coop and appeared to be searching for something. Then, he found it, an egg. He lifted it carefully and stared at it for a long moment, his strange muttering stopping for the first time. Then, in a hushed voice, he whispered something to the egg, words I couldn't make out. I strained to hear, but the sounds vanished into the breeze. Without warning, he brought the egg to his mouth and bit down. I watched, frozen in shock. His front teeth were missing, and his mouth was shaped oddly as he chewed. As he bit through the shell, bright yellow yolk oozed down his chin and dripped onto his clothes. I could hear the crunch of the shell between his teeth. My stomach twisted. A wave of nausea hit me, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was going to scream or be sick. Then, I snapped out of my trance and let out a loud, terrified scream. The man turned his head toward me, but he didn't stop eating. He simply stared while continuing to chew. Heart pounding, I bolted from the barn, my feet splashing through the wet grass. I raced up the back steps and into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My entire body trembled with fear, but my biggest worry was for my dogs. I had left them outside with him. Frantically, I pulled back the curtain on the back door's window and peered outside. To my horror, the strange man was standing in the middle of our yard, staring directly at the house. Even more unsettling, my dogs were licking bits of raw egg from his fingertips as if he were an old friend. Despite their calm demeanor, I felt an overwhelming sense of danger. I needed help, fast. As I reached for the phone, the man's muttering grew louder. My hands shook as I dialed my mother's work number. The babbling noise became more frantic, and I could hear it getting closer. Barely able to speak, I managed to tell my mom that a strange man was on our property. She told me to go upstairs immediately. I obeyed, climbing the stairs as quietly as I could. My mother hung up quickly to call the police. Just as I reached my room and locked the door, I heard heavy footsteps on the back porch. Then, loud banging against the door. I crawled under my bed, pressing myself into the darkness, barely breathing as I listened. Time stretched endlessly. The banging continued, punctuated by odd, frustrated yells. I expected the glass to shatter or the door to burst open at any moment. Then, suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance. The police had arrived. From my hiding spot, I heard officers speaking firmly to the man outside. His babbling grew more panicked, almost fearful. Finally feeling safe, I crept downstairs and peered out the window. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the yard. My mother was sprinting up the driveway, her face pale with worry. She rushed inside and wrapped me in a tight hug, kissing my forehead repeatedly while the police asked me questions. I felt embarrassed by all the attention, but she didn't seem to care. She was just relieved I was safe. Later that night, the police took the man into custody. A week later, officers returned with more information. The man, who we later learned was named Jim, had been living in our barn at night and hiding in the woods during the day. He wasn't usually dangerous, which explained why our dogs weren't afraid of him. In fact, they had grown accustomed to his presence. Jim had serious health issues and had been struggling to survive. My mother, being the compassionate woman she was, helped him get medical care, find housing, and even gave him small jobs to help out. Over time, Jim became part of our lives. He was never a bad man, just someone who needed kindness. Years later, I attended his funeral. He had spent his final years with support, friends, and a sense of belonging. Though our first encounter had terrified me, Jim's story had a peaceful ending, thanks to my mother's generosity. My parents were searching for a vacation home. Instead of purchasing a house by the water in the Hamptons, they chose an old 18th century farmhouse in upstate New York, one with a reputation for being haunted. The farmhouse sat on 100 acres of land and had 7 bedrooms. There was also a tenant house divided into 2 sections, one for male servants and the other for female servants. Several small buildings were scattered across the property, including a one-room schoolhouse that had been built long ago. The schoolhouse had a small dome, called a cupola, with a large bell hanging inside that once rang to signal the start of class. Not far from it stood a massive barn, constructed from aged wood. The barn was so spacious that it featured elegant mahogany stalls for horses, each one glowing warmly when sunlight streamed through the gaps in the wood. We were told that the land had witnessed intense battles during the French and Indian War. Later, the property had also served as a stagecoach inn, offering weary travelers a place to rest, enjoy a meal, and share tales of distant lands. There was an undeniable heaviness to the house, a lingering, somber presence that made it feel as if the spirits and echoes of the past were still there, quietly observing. No matter where you stood, you had the eerie sensation of being watched from the dim corners of the rooms. I vividly recall sitting alone in the living room one summer afternoon, watching TV while my mother and siblings were out shopping in town. I Love Lucy was playing, one of the few shows we could get on our limited channels, when I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The feeling was so intense that fear took over, and I immediately left the house, choosing to walk toward town instead. Years later, I discovered that my brother had gone through the exact same experience, and had reacted in the exact same way. The first truly unexplainable event happened in my bedroom, which contained 2 twin beds. That weekend, my mother and I were the only ones staying at the house, and she had decided to sleep in the other bed. Just before dawn, I was jolted awake by the sound of sheets rustling. The noise was steady, like someone shifting under the covers repeatedly. I lay still, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the sound. Slowly, I turned over to see what was happening, only to find the bed completely empty. At first, I assumed my mother was in my brother's room making his bed, since his room shared a wall with mine. But she wasn't there. She was in the kitchen, on the far end of our enormous house. You have to understand, this house was massive. The kitchen was on the first floor, while my bedroom was on the second. They were so far apart that even if something as loud as an explosion had gone off in the kitchen, I probably wouldn't have heard it from my room. One night, my mother, who had always been skeptical of ghosts, was staying at the house alone. She chose to sleep in my room, just as she had that other weekend. In the middle of the night, she felt something heavy settle onto the foot of her bed, pressing the mattress down. At first, she assumed she was imagining it or still half dreaming. But when she looked closely, she could see the mattress visibly depressed, as though an unseen figure had actually sat there. The room was empty, there was no one else around. The only sounds were her own quickened breaths and the faint rustling of the sheets. We owned the house for many years, and in that time, plenty of strange things happened. There was also a well-known haunted restaurant in town called the Bull's Head Inn. It was an expensive place, so we rarely ate there. I never personally witnessed anything strange there, but local stories about the place were common. According to legend, the bar area had once been the bedroom of an old woman who was part of the temperance movement. She was firmly against alcohol. People claimed that she would make her presence known by tossing cocktail napkins onto the floor, and some even said she had been known to break glasses. I've told this story many times, yet I still get chills whenever I think about that night just a few years ago. My friend and I love exploring places in Connecticut that are rumored to be haunted. We would drive to abandoned houses, dense forests, and old buildings, always hoping to experience something paranormal. But no matter how many eerie places we visited, we never actually saw anything unusual, until one particular night. That evening, we decided to visit my hometown. It's a small farming community where cornfields stretch for miles, and barns of all kinds dot the landscape. Some barns are modern and well-kept, while others are weathered and crumbling with age. I grew up in a town where everyone knew each other, and many people, including my father, worked in the fields when they were younger. My father often shared stories from his time working on a local farm, but one memory stood out, one that always sent a shiver down my spine. He and the other workers would sometimes see a strange man walking along the rafters of a massive barn at the edge of the field. The rafters, which are the wooden beams supporting the roof, would creak under his steps. Many farmhands had seen this man before, but only a few knew the truth about him. One day, curiosity got the best of my father, and he asked about the man. The response made his face turn pale. The man was a ghost. Fast forward to a recent ghost hunting trip my friend and I took, and we decided to track down that very barn. Getting onto the property was easy since the owners were family friends who had given us permission to explore. As we drove down the long dirt path toward the back fields, we joked that the whole experience felt straight out of a horror movie. Heavy rains from earlier in the week had left the road muddy and full of deep puddles, making every turn feel uncertain. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the sky as another storm slowly rolled in. To help navigate, I pulled out my phone and opened Google Maps. The aerial view showed the entire property, and I could see a small marker where the barn had once stood. But something caught my attention. The barn had long since collapsed and was now hidden deep within the trees, making it impossible to see from the road. I decided to keep this detail to myself. As we neared the location, an overwhelming pressure suddenly filled our chests. The heaviness was suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened around us. But the moment we drove past the area, the sensation vanished. Despite our fear, curiosity got the better of us. We wanted a clearer look, so we turned the car around and parked. We aimed the headlights into the forest, hoping to illuminate whatever was hidden in the darkness. Instantly, the oppressive feeling returned, stronger than before. It wasn't just fear anymore. It felt like something was angry. Then, movement caught our eyes. A shadow emerged from the bushes in front of where the barn once stood. It had the shape of a man, standing still, watching us. Panic set in. We scrambled to get the car moving, nearly getting stuck in the thick mud as we sped out of the field. That terrible feeling of anger and dread clung to us, refusing to fade until we were far from the farm. The drive home was silent, the heavy rain from the approaching storm pounding against the windshield. When we finally got back, the first words we spoke were to my father. "You were right.